I'm Teisha Bader, and in the news, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's announcement to halt the judicial reform legislation and the events that led up to that decision, including the massive protests and general strike in Israel that followed Netanyahu's firing of his defense minister 2 days prior, Gallant. Well, to help shed light on the current situation and what is happening in Israel now is veteran journalist Calev Ben-David, who has reported on Israel and the Middle East for over 3 decades. He is the anchor on I-24 News' daily news program in Israel, The Rundown, and a political diplomatic analyst for the channel. He was also previously the managing editor of the Jerusalem Post and Israel bureau chief for Bloomberg News, among many other titles. He joins us now from Jerusalem and the I-24 studios. Calev, thank you so much for being here. I know it is a crazy time, so we really appreciate you joining us here on JBS today.
My pleasure, Teisha.
So what is the feeling in the country now, if you can sort of summarize, since the last few days of just very dramatic events?
I would say very briefly, a sigh of relief. I think certainly those that oppose the reforms as proposed by the Netanyahu government, but even many of the people who maybe support them, but have been upset by the way they've divided the Israeli public and feel that the best way now to go about it is to try to reach consensus, at least among some of the opposition with the Netanyahu government, is the best way to go forward. So I think the country is taking a bit of a sigh of relief at the time. And just to update you, this evening, Israel, and I'm speaking to you now on a Tuesday evening in Israel, the negotiations will begin at the residence of President Isaac Herzog in Jerusalem, and the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, and the political parties of Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid will send their negotiating teams, and they're going to start seeing if they could find some kind of consensus here.
Which is, as you said, a huge sigh of relief, not just for Israel, but all of us watching from all over the world. Honestly, it's obviously a huge sigh of relief as well for us, but we can't compare to what Israelis have been going through the last several weeks. Let's talk a minute. I would love your impressions about Netanyahu's speech last night. He obviously said some very important things, which people were waiting for him to say, like the main thing, we're pausing, we're taking a delay, we're halting. But he said other things as well, namely that we will get to the reforms, they will get done, but with a more broad consensus. And then he also spoke very firmly against IDF reservists refusing to serve and show up for duty. So can you touch on those two things and just what you made of his comments?
Certainly, as you say, on the key substance of Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech, the fact that he is willing now to call a halt, a freeze in the legislative process on the judicial reforms, that was very, I think, welcomed by all parties here. Again, keep in mind that had he not done that, a vote in Parliament on one of the key and most controversial aspects of these judicial reforms, which is the process of choosing judges in Israel, would have come to a final vote in Parliament either today or tomorrow and would have gone into law. So certainly the fact that he was willing to pause that and start these negotiations, that was well received. About the tone of the Prime Minister's speech, there's been mixed reaction. He used an analogy, biblical analogy of the famous story of King Solomon faced with 2 women who wanted divide, can't decide whose child, they're fighting over a child, and one is willing to have the baby divided in half and one not. And people were saying, well, did he mean that the woman who was willing to divide a baby in half and kill it were the people who were opposed to reform? So mixed reaction on that analogy. I do want to clarify something about the reservists. The reservists who have said that they will not do volunteer duty. People don't really understand that. A lot of key reservists in Israel actually don't have mandatory reserve duty. They have volunteer duty. These are people like pilots and cyber experts who have expertise that you need from years of experience, even though they may have been well beyond the age of being called up for reserve duty. So that has been the ones that have said, we may not volunteer Some say that that should have been made clearer in the prime minister's speech. But all in all, yes, the nation breathed a sigh of relief, and the fact that it heralded the start of these negotiations.
And thank you for making that distinction about the reservists, because that's an important distinction. He was very harsh about the reservists, and he did not make that clear. So I appreciate the fact that you did. Calev, as someone who's lived in Israel for many, many years and has seen a lot of things, were you surprised at the incredible just numbers of people that have taken to the streets week after week, day after day? It's really remarkable. I mean, however you feel on this issue, it is really something to behold.
Teisha, I've never seen anything like this. I've been in Israel and reporting on Israel for now almost 4 decades. Unprecedented. Have never seen anything like this. And let me say this. This was protests unlike any other. Remember, protests against, for example, a Prime Minister Netanyahu are nothing new. There were protests when he was, for example, in his previous government, when he was indicted on corruption charges, and you had weekly protests outside his official residence, but much smaller compared to this. But the fact that they were so widespread, many people who had never before come out to protest, the fact that you had major leaders of the business community, that you had the National Labor Union called the Histadrut, which had never taken sides. They've had work shortages, but never on political issues, always on questions of wages and work conditions and work-related. The fact that they called a national day, a national strike that even stopped departing flights from Ben Gurion Airport over this issue, that doctors and health professionals went on strike. All of this was unprecedented. And whether right or wrong, whether you agree with it or not, that does speak to the fact that these protesters felt that these judicial reforms, as originally presented a danger to Israeli democracy, and felt they had to go out and do it. So never seen anything like this in Israel, for sure.
Would you say that there were people also, even people who perhaps voted for Netanyahu, that were there because...
Absolutely. There were people that voted for Netanyahu. I'm saying, I don't want to give numbers or over exaggerate it, but there were cases where people had said they voted for Netanyahu, but they just felt that even they agree with the fact that there should be judicial reforms. That's actually a policy that many people in Israel, not only just on the right, people on the left have also supported some judicial reforms. Certainly that's a big issue for people on the right, but they didn't like the way it was the way that it was went about, the government went about it. They didn't feel that the government explained it sufficiently to the public, that they didn't try to build some kind of consensus, at least get some members of the opposition on board, because there are some members of the opposition who have supported judicial reforms. And they didn't like the way it was taking place. And even though some of those people came out in protest.
So if you can kind of break down the crux of the judicial reform issue, as you're saying, most people perhaps support some changes, but what, if you had to summarize, like the main heart of it, what really scared people the most about this overhaul that seemed more extreme than just some changes? Because there are some people saying, some people saying, oh, it's a false narrative. It wasn't really a huge overhaul. No. What is it?
No, it was a huge overhaul. First of all, the judges, all power to whatever the government empowered be for choosing judges. And of course, the most other controversial, that the government, with just 61 seats in parliament out of 120 seats, could overturn any ruling by the Supreme Court. Of course, in the United States, the Supreme Court has something that they call judicial review. They can rule on legislation by Congress. How judges are chosen is a more political process in the United States. That has to be said. There are people who feel that the way judges are chosen here should be changed in a way that would better reflect the diversity of judges, that there should be more judges who are religious, that there's judges who should be more from what we call in Israel Mizrahi or Sephardi, from Middle Eastern countries, that the courts were not representative enough. And that is a criticism. That's one of the most popular aspects of judicial reform, but criticism about the best way to go about it, not simply to give the government, whatever government in power, a blank check on choosing whoever they want to be judges, that there should be more of a collaborative process with the opposition, with the judiciary itself, with legal professionals. But certainly they want some change in that, but not just to give whatever government power the most. And the second is in the question of, there is a debate. Is Israel's Supreme Court or High Court, as it's called, sometimes is it too activist? Does it take an active role in overruling legislation of the parliament, the Knesset? And there is debate about that, but the original reform proposed by the Netanyahu government would have allowed 61 members of parliament. That's just a majority of just one to overrule any ruling by the Supreme Court. And even people who believe there should be some power for the Knesset, the parliament, to do that, it should be something in the way of more 70 or 80 or 90. So it's when a ruling is overruled, it's not just the government in power, but it should also include some members of the opposition and even some members of Israel's minorities, perhaps. And that's another thing, that basically minority rights, the government, even if it's a democratically elected government, in a democracy does not mean majority rule can do anything. In a democracy, there is also rule of law. There is also protecting the rights of minorities, inalienable rights. Part of the problem is Israel does not have a written constitution. Some of those things are in the Declaration of Independence, but they're not enshrined in actual constitutional law. So it was a feeling that these judicial reforms would go too far in giving whatever government in power, even if it was by a very slim majority, basically the power to do anything it wanted. And that was the crux of the issue.
So do you think that Netanyahu realizes that? In his speech, he says he hears the voices of all the people. It's very hard to separate politics, of course, from this type of situation. Right. But do you have
Teisha, it's a great question, because the question is, clearly Benjamin Netanyahu realizes the way his government went about trying to bring these reforms was wrong. Because he never expected the kind of backlash that was got. So certainly on the process of bringing these reforms, there was a realization by him and others in the government that was wrong. On the substance, whether they think that some of the substance of the reforms just go too far, well, that's going to be tested in negotiations. We'll have to see how much compromise there's going to be on the government side, but also how much compromise they're going to be on the opposition side. And some people think, for example, you might see a division in the opposition between what some might say is the more liberal party of Yair Lapid and the more centrist party of Benny Gantz, which includes, for example, the former Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar, who came from the Likud and has himself talked about the need for judicial reforms. So all this will be proven, tested in the coming negotiations.
Yeah, one of the things that we've heard so many times repeated, directed towards Netanyahu and others, is put your ego aside, put your political aspirations aside, put the country first. And that just seems to be what the public is just asking from whomever, put the country first.
Right.
What are your
So
hopes?
let me even say, well, you know what, there's another issue we haven't discussed, which is a related issue, which is the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu fired the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, which is really what sparked the latest huge round of protests. Just a day after Yoav Gallant said, these reforms, the divisions over these reforms are endangering the security of Israel because some of these reservists are going to refuse to do volunteer duty. And he was fired because of that. And some people said, yeah, he should not have been. Maybe, especially we're entering a very sensitive security period. The Muslim holiday of Ramadan is coming. There's an upsurge in Palestinian terrorism right now. And Netanyahu should have waited before replacing him, or should have said or disciplined him in some way. And many people feel that was more of a kind of ego-driven thing. So this will be a test. People are waiting also to see how Prime Minister Netanyahu reacts, maybe rescinds his dismissal of Defense Minister Gallant. We'll see. Again, that's one of the things we'll only know in the coming weeks. To what degree Prime Minister Netanyahu has been chastened by the public reaction to some of his more recent moves.
Yeah, and I read that he actually met with Gallant today. I don't know if you have confirmation of that, because Gallant has been fired, but he still maintains the position, or if there's some, I guess, hasn't officially like signed off on leaving. So
right, he is not signed off. He's not. Well, actually, he didn't receive an official notification. There's anyway a waiting period. There's been talk of a successor, but actually, someone has not even been named the successor. So we don't know yet. It's not clear. It may be that his dismissal may be delayed until, for example, after the holidays coming up, the Passover holiday, maybe even Independence Day. We don't really have clarity yet on how that's going to play out.
So Calev, I know you can't really predict the future. It would be nice if you could, but what are your hopes, or what do you think might come out of these negotiations? You mentioned Herzog began them tonight, meeting with different representatives from a variety of parties. What are your gut feelings? And
Okay, so I will tell you, there's certainly a portion of Israelis, hardcore supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Israeli right, that want to see these reforms passed in the original forms. There's certainly a hardcore of opposition, more on the left, that won't accept any reforms from the Netanyahu, by this government. But I would say the majority of Israelis want to see some kind of compromise reached here. Some reforms done in the courts, maybe some reforms that balances a little more authority to the ruling coalition in parliament, that enables a diverse selection of judges especially to the Supreme Court, but still keeps the courts as a part of the checks and balances that any democracy has to have. And I repeat, democracy is not just majority rule. There has to be some kind of checks and balances. So I'm sure the majority of Israelis want to see some kind of compromise reached out of this, so the country could focus on its really pressing issues, which is certainly first and foremost the security situation, this upsurge in terrorism, Palestinian terrorism, dealing with Iran and its potential nuclear threat, and also the economic situation, which is uncertain here as it is elsewhere in the world. So hopefully things will come to pass and Passover, let's say, and maybe by Passover, there'll be a Passover miracle of sorts and some kind of compromise will be reached.
I hope so. I hope so. Before I let you go, I want to go back to the protest just for a moment, because I think something, if you can say a silver lining or just something that I just found so moving, was the protesters waving Israeli flags, wrapped in Israeli flags, saying, we love this country. We are not against this country. We love this country with our heart and soul, and we serve and we do everything we can. We send our children to the army. We do all this for the love of 100%, this country.
Teisha. And it's very interesting that until that point, these last few months, the waving of Israeli flags at protests has only been associated with the right wing in Israel, and with on issues, people who are more hawkish, let's say, when it comes to the Israeli-Arab conflict here. And many people felt that, you didn't see that in protests, for example, more by the liberal or left side. But that's why, in a sense, it did transcend that divide. And we did see Israeli flags. That was the symbol of this protest, the Israeli flags, and people singing the Israeli song, Ein li eretz acheret. I have no other country. This is my country too. I'm part of it. We believe in a state that is Jewish and democratic. Both of those intertwined, and that was reclaimed somewhat by certainly a large part of the public in the past few weeks.
Well, Calev, I hope that that things continue to move forward in a way that, as you said, a broad consensus can be reached, that the majority of Israelis feel that their voices are being heard. And thank you so much. Again, I know this is a very intense time, and we really appreciate you being here tremendously. Thank you, Calev.
My pleasure, Teisha. And happy Passover holiday to you and all of your viewers.
Thank you so much. Happy holidays to you as well, and peaceful holidays. Calev Ben-David is a veteran journalist. He is the anchor at I-24 News, The Rundown, and we thank him so much for being here on JBS. Thank you, as always, of course, to our director, Sloan Copeland, managing director, Dara Gallant, technical manager, Michael Paley, transmissions manager, John McDevitt, producer, Carol Lilienthal, and thank you for watching In the News.